April 21, 1945. Smoke rose from the red clay fields of East Texas, not from battle, but from barbecue pits dug into the soil. Hickory wood crackled in the spring air, sending ribbons of blue-gray smoke drifting across rows of tents and wooden barracks. A hand-painted sign on a mess hall door read, Camp Tyler, POW Area C, Women's Section. Inside the wire, a dozen German women stood in formation, watching the smoke drift toward them with something between suspicion and hunger. They were Luftwaffe auxiliaries, clerks, typists, nurses, captured months earlier in France and shipped across the ocean. Their war had ended, but their disbelief had not. They had been told the Americans were cruel, that their prisons were labor camps, that surrender meant humiliation. Yet here they were in Texas, under a sky too big to hate, smelling meat they hadn't seen in years. The nearest thing to hunger relief they knew was watery cabbage soup. But now, as the sun pressed down and the smoke thickened, the guards wheeled out metal tubs filled with ribs, shining with sauce, steaming, glistening red as lacquer. The women's eyes followed them like hawks. Then came laughter from the guards, cheerful, unguarded, almost absurd. "Don't look so scared, ladies," drawled Private Daniels, a tall, freckled farm boy from Kansas. "Ain't no poison in it. Just Texas heat." He gestured toward the grill, where Sergeant Willie Carter, a black cook from Louisiana, flipped racks of pork with tongs as long as a saber. His apron was stained with spice and smoke. "They call it barbecue," Daniels explained, his grin widening. "We do this when we're happy the war's ending." Ilse, the eldest of the German women at 25, raised her chin. "Das ist Bauernfutter," she muttered under her breath, farmhand food. She spoke it with practiced disdain, as though saying the word might preserve a shred of pride. Greta, standing beside her, half-starved and too tired to pretend superiority, whispered, "It smells good." Ilse shot her a look sharp enough to cut. "We are prisoners, not guests." A breeze carried the sweet tang of vinegar and molasses across the yard. The guards were setting up wooden tables, tin cups, even a phonograph that crackled out a tune. "Don't fence me in." The women flinched at the irony of the lyrics. They had been fenced in for months. Beyond the wire, a world of green stretched endlessly, pine forests, distant farms, and the glimmer of a lake. For the first time, the war felt very far away. The narrator's voice would have paused here, steady and reflective. In April 1945, as the Reich crumbled, over 400,000 German prisoners were held across the United States. Texas alone housed nearly 50,000. Most were men. But a handful, clerks, telephonists, medical staff, were women caught in the tide of surrender. Ilse remembered the voyage across the Atlantic, the hum of the ship's engines, the endless water, the whispered prayers. She remembered arriving in New York and seeing skyscrapers still glowing after blackout years. America had power to waste. To her, this barbecue was another symbol of excess, of a nation so rich it didn't understand restraint. Still, her stomach twisted at the scent. Hunger eroded pride faster than propaganda ever could. Private Daniels and Sergeant Carter began serving plates. Ribs, cornbread, a scoop of beans, a slice of pickle. Each plate was handed with a grin, as if feeding family. The women hesitated, unsure whether to take them. One guard laughed. "Go on now. We won't shoot you for eating." They stepped forward slowly, hands trembling, eyes darting toward the watchtower as if waiting for punishment. None came. The first bite came from Anna, the youngest, barely 20, with freckles under her gray dust of fatigue. She sank her teeth into the rib's soft flesh. Her eyes widened. Smoke and sugar, pepper and salt, flavors she'd never known filled her mouth. The others watched her chew, waiting for disgust. None came. Instead, a small sound escaped her, a sigh of surrender. Greta followed, then Ilse, reluctantly. The sauce was sticky, sweet, smoky. It burned the tongue, but the pain was pleasant, almost holy. They ate in silence, the guards grinning, the air thick with the hum of cicadas and laughter. Ilse looked around the yard. A few women had stopped eating, staring at their plates as if trying to reconcile what they'd been told with what they now tasted. They had been raised on stories of American chaos, crime, jazz, and materialism. Yet here was order, warmth, and enough food to feed an army. She glanced at Carter, who wiped sweat from his brow and smiled without malice. He'd spent the morning cooking for the very people his nation had fought to destroy. It unsettled her. Later that day, as the sun dipped low and painted the camp gold, the women lingered near the fence, watching the guards toss horseshoes. Laughter echoed across the yard. Daniels waved at them. "You ladies ever try ribs back home?" Ilsa shook her head. "We do not cook like this," she said stiffly. "Too much sugar. Too wild." He laughed. "Wild's what makes it good." She didn't reply. Inside, she couldn't stop thinking of that word, wild. To her, it had meant chaos. Here, it meant freedom. The narrator's tone darkened slightly. For most of these women, meat had been absent from their diets since 1942. German civilians survived on 1,000 calories a day, bread, margarine, and ersatz coffee. In Texas, even the prison diet was triple that. The contrast was not just culinary, it was moral. As dusk fell, a jeep rolled past the fence, its radio playing, "You Are My Sunshine." The melody drifted into the women's barracks long after lights out. Ilsa lay on her cot, stomach full for the first time in years, listening to the faint hum of crickets. The sound reminded her of peace she'd never known. She turned to Greta. "Do you think they do this to mock us?" Greta's voice was soft. "No. I think they do it because they can." In that answer lay the heart of her unease. Power expressed not through cruelty, but through generosity. It was disarming. She thought of the bombs that had flattened Cologne, the propaganda that said Americans were beasts. Yet the same hands that dropped fire from the sky now passed her cornbread and smiled. The contradiction kept her awake long after the music faded. Outside, the smoke from the pit still hung in the cool night air, mingling with the scent of pine and rain. Carter doused the coals and wiped his hands. "Those gals don't know what hit 'em," he said quietly to Daniels. The private laughed. "Give 'em another week and they'll be a skin for seconds." Inside the barracks, Ilsa whispered a line she didn't understand why she said aloud. "They eat like kings." It wasn't envy in her voice but awe. She realized, for the first time, that the war had been fought by people who believed life could be generous, not scarce. The narrator's voice returns, low and reflective. For Ilsa and the others, that first barbecue was more than a meal. It was an introduction to a world that had defeated them not with bombs, but with abundance. Beyond the camp, thunder rumbled faintly, a reminder that storms still moved across both oceans. But here, for one evening in April, the only smoke in the sky was from hickory wood, not war. And by the time the stars rose above the pine trees, even Ilsa, proud and unbending, had to admit, if only to herself, that something in her had begun to change. What came next, however, would test that fragile warmth in ways none of them could imagine. The next morning broke warm and windless, the Texas air still heavy with the ghost of hickory smoke. The camp stirred early, guards cleaning rifles that hadn't been fired in weeks, prisoners sweeping the dust from between the barracks planks. Yet beneath the routine, there lingered something new, a faint unease disguised as curiosity. The women had eaten like guests the night before, but pride rarely digests kindness easily. Ilsa walked to the water pump with her canteen, her steps crisp, as if discipline could wash away the memory of sweetness. When the water splashed over her hands, she caught the faint scent of smoke still clinging to her hair and frowned. "They feed us like nobles," she muttered. "But why? What do they want?" Private Daniels, chewing tobacco by the gate, caught her expression and grinned. "Morning, ma'am," he called in his slow, teasing drawl. "Sleep well? Dream about them ribs." Ilsa shot him a look sharp enough to slice wire. He laughed anyway, tipping his cap. To him, the prisoner's suspicion was almost endearing, proof that kindness was working faster than any lecture could. "Don't worry," he added. "There's more coming Saturday. Might make it a tradition." That word, tradition, hung in Ilsa's mind all day. In Germany, tradition had meant order, obedience, ceremony. Here, it meant a cookout with music and jokes. By noon, talk of another barbecue day buzzed through the camp like rumor. Some women dismissed it as mockery, a strange American performance meant to flaunt abundance before defeated eyes. Others, secretly, prayed it was true. Sergeant Carter stood by the mess hut preparing the sauce again. Vinegar, molasses, brown sugar, mustard, and pepper. The mixture boiled in a black pot, thick as syrup. The smell drifted far beyond the wire, curling around the barracks and settling deep into memory. Greta passed by with a basket of laundry, inhaled once, and closed her eyes. She had once worked in a hospital ward that smelled of disinfectant and fear. This aroma, sweet, earthy, alive, felt like rebellion against that past. Ilsa, however, couldn't shake her irritation. She watched Carter work, his broad back glistening with sweat, his easy command of the space unsettling her. In Germany, a man like him would have been invisible, silenced by the color of his skin. Yet here, soldiers, white soldiers, took orders from him in the kitchen. Daniels even joked that Sergeant Carter's ribs could end wars. Ilsa tried to laugh, but the sound came out brittle. "Wars are not ended by food," she said quietly. "Maybe not," Daniels replied. "But they sure start fewer when bellies are full." That afternoon, the women were called to help set the tables. Long planks laid over barrels, tin plates stacked high, jars of pickles glinting in the sun. The Americans insisted they help. "Part of the fun," they said. To Ilsa, it felt like theater. Yet as she folded napkins and aligned cups, she found herself humming without realizing it. The tune was old, something from childhood, before uniforms and orders. Carter noticed, smiled, and began humming along. Their melodies met awkwardly, then found rhythm. For a brief, strange moment, it felt like music might bridge what words could not. When the food came out, it came in abundance. Ribs again, darker and glossier than before, cornbread golden from butter, beans sweetened with sugar, and even slices of watermelon chilled in ice. The women gathered around, staring. One of them, a tall blonde named Ruth, whispered, "It looks barbaric." Another answered, "Or divine." Ilsa folded her arms. "They show us meat so we forget the war," she said. But Greta shook her head. "Maybe they show us how to live again." It was an unguarded remark, almost defiant in its softness. Carter clanged a ladle against the pot. "All right now. Line up, ladies. Y'all know the drill." The guards chuckled as the women stepped forward one by one. The smell was maddening. One prisoner crossed herself before tasting. Another muttered that she'd rather starve than eat food soaked in sugar. Yet when the first bite came, resolve melted faster than butter. They chewed, they blinked, they sighed. Even Ilsa, rigid, skeptical Ilsa, felt the flavor unravel her caution. The sauce burned her tongue but left sweetness behind. She coughed once, then took another bite, slower this time, thoughtful. Nearby, Daniels leaned against the fence, watching with quiet satisfaction. "See?" he murmured. "Ain't so bad being on the losing side if the winner can cook." The guard beside him chuckled. "You reckon they'll start liking us now?" Daniels spat into the dirt. "You can't hate a man who feeds you. Not forever." The afternoon sun hung low, turning the camp golden. The women's laughter began softly, tentative, unsure, and then, as plates emptied, it grew. They joked about the sticky sauce, about how Americans seemed to eat with both hands and half their face. For a few minutes, the war receded. The guards told stories, how in Kansas City, barbecue competitions were like religion, how Carter's grandmother had taught him every spice by smell. Greta asked, shyly, "Why use so much sugar?" Carter grinned. "Because we can, ma'am. Ain't had to ration since the Depression." The women exchanged glances. Sugar was wealth, meat was memory, and both were flowing freely here. "Even your prisoners eat like kings," Ilsa said at last, half to herself. Carter shrugged. "Ain't prisoners today. Just folks eatin' ribs." Silence fell after that. A silence thick with realization. Somewhere, beyond the fence, a mockingbird sang. Later, when the dishes were cleared and twilight began to fall, Carter carried the last rack of ribs to the edge of the wire. "For y'all to share later," he said simply. Ilsa hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing his. His hands were rough, but warm. She expected mockery in his eyes. Instead, she found something harder to face: kindness. That night, the women sat outside their barracks beneath a pale moon, chewing slowly, quietly. Greta whispered, "It tastes like forgiveness." Ilse said nothing. She stared at the horizon, where lightning flickered far away, a storm crawling across unseen miles. Her thoughts moved slower than the thunder, confused, restless, unwilling to yield. She had built her identity on certainty. Germany strong, America crude. Yet here, surrounded by laughter and plenty, that certainty began to dissolve. The narrator's tone would have dropped to a whisper. Historians later confirmed these accounts through Red Cross inspections and camp diaries. One woman wrote, "I did not know food could change a heart. But it did." When the lights dimmed, the camp quieted, and only the sound of the night insects remained. Ilse rose and approached the fence. The coals still glowed faintly in the pit beyond, the smell of spice still clinging to the air. She pressed her hand against the wire, feeling its coolness. Somewhere behind her, a woman laughed in her sleep, a light, free sound. Ilse looked toward the guard tower, then at the stars. For the first time, the sky didn't feel like an enemy's sky. She whispered into the dark, "If this is defeat, what was victory?" The question hung in the humid air, unanswered but alive. The narrator's final line would carry the weight of revelation. They had mocked the meal as farmhand food, too rough, too sweet, too American. But as the smoke faded and silence settled, even pride began to taste different. And by dawn, as the first light touched the camp, Ilse knew the next time she smelled hickory smoke, she would not think of hunger, or of war, but of something far more dangerous to prejudice: understanding. The following Sunday dawned clear and slow, the kind of morning where sound traveled gently. Boots on gravel, birds over pine. Inside the women's compound, breakfast plates clattered, and someone was laughing, an unfamiliar sound. The second barbecue had been announced casually the day before, but it carried a strange undercurrent. The guards called it hospitality. To Ilse, it felt like something else, an experiment. Could generosity really tame hatred? She didn't know. Yet when she tied her hair with a strip of cloth and stepped outside, she caught herself humming again. She hated that she was humming. Sergeant Carter was already at the pit, sleeves rolled up, humming too. His rhythm matched the sizzle of the ribs. Daniels stood beside him, flipping through a crumpled deck of cards, waiting for the day to wake fully. "You ever notice," Carter said without looking up, "these ladies come out earlier every Sunday now?" Daniels grinned. "Guess the smell beats an alarm clock." By midday, the heat shimmered across the yard. The Germans were told they could sit near the mess tents while the meal cooked, a privilege never offered before. They hesitated at first, unsure whether it was allowed to look comfortable. But Carter's voice broke the formality. "Ain't no rule says you can't enjoy a little shade." They sat beneath a pecan tree, dresses faded from washing, faces turned toward the sun as though thawing from years of cold. Greta watched Carter work with fascination. He moved like someone who had turned labor into art. "He cooks like a surgeon," she whispered. Ilse gave a tight smile. "Or a magician." She couldn't deny that the man had become the quiet axis of this strange piece. Every movement he made drew both prisoners and guards into orbit. When he passed by with a tray, Ilse caught the scent of cloves on his apron, and felt her stomach turn in that confusing way hunger and admiration sometimes overlap. Music began again, this time not from a radio, but from Daniels himself, plucking a harmonica. The tune was uneven, playful. One of the younger prisoners, Anna, tapped her foot shyly in rhythm. Carter clapped once. "That's it. Don't let him play alone." A ripple of awkwardness passed through the women, but Greta started clapping too. Soon, the fence between captor and captive blurred into a line of rhythm and dust. The narrator's tone might have softened here, offering context. In those last weeks of the war, the Texas camp stood far from Europe's ruin. While cities burned overseas, here the only smoke came from barbecue pits. It was a theater of contradictions. Enemy soldiers treated not as threats, but as guests of circumstance. After the meal, Carter called for volunteers to help serve. Ilse surprised even herself by standing. Daniels raised an eyebrow but said nothing, just handed her a ladle. "Hot sauce duty," he said. "Careful, that one bites back." Her lips curved, almost a smile. "Like you Americans." For an hour, she served ribs beside him, her movements awkward at first, then natural. Prisoners lined up, and guards mixed among them, no longer watching so closely. There were jokes, laughter, a few brave attempts at English. "Good food, thank you." Daniels, wiping sweat from his brow, muttered, "Never thought I'd see Nazis say please." Carter shot him a look. "They people, same as you." Daniels paused, then nodded. "Yeah, same as me." Later, as plates emptied and the sun dropped low, Ilsa lingered near the pit. The air shimmered with smoke and light. "You feed us," she said quietly, "as if we are not enemies." Carter shrugged. "Maybe 'cause war's about done. And when a war's done, enemies don't stay enemies long. They just go back to bein' folks trying to live." His words struck something raw inside her. She had lived her whole life believing nations could not forgive. But this man spoke as if forgiveness was as ordinary as firewood. She wanted to argue, to preserve the structure of the world she'd been taught. But then Greta walked past carrying plates of leftovers, laughing with two guards. They were sharing a joke about accents, both sides mimicking each other's mispronunciations. Ilsa realized, with a sting of jealousy, that the laughter didn't sound forced. It sounded free. That evening, the camp commandant, an older officer named Major Harland, paid a visit. He stood watching from the gate, pipe between his teeth, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "You've got yourself quite the social club here, Sergeant," he said dryly. Carter wiped his hands on his apron. "Just feed in people, sir." Harland studied him. "And you think food fixes hate?" Carter hesitated. "Don't know about fixin', sir. But it sure makes folks quiet enough to think." The major exhaled, smoke curling around his face. "Then keep cooking." That night, Ilsa couldn't sleep. She sat by the window of her barack, looking out at the dying coals. Across the yard, Carter sat alone beside the pit, head bowed, humming something low and bluesy. She didn't understand the melody, but it carried a sadness she recognized. The ache of someone who had seen too much of what divides people, and was still choosing to believe in warmth. She whispered to Greta, "He has no hate." Greta smiled faintly. "Maybe that's his strength. Maybe that's what wins wars without guns." The narrator's voice might have turned reflective. Historians would later find diary pages from Camp Tyler, written in pencil by the same women who had arrived hardened and hollow. They wrote of laughter, of songs, of meals that confused them. One line read simply, "We did not know victory could be generous." Days passed, and the rhythm of the camp changed. Guards greeted them by name. The women were allowed to tend a small garden near the fence. Tomatoes, beans, wildflowers. Ilsa found herself kneeling in the soil beside Carter one morning, both of them silent. He pointed to the seedlings. "You plant something in good ground, it grows, no matter where it come from." She nodded, the metaphor unspoken but understood. By the third Sunday, the fence no longer felt like a prison line, more like a border between worlds that were slowly merging. Yet not everyone was comfortable. A new batch of soldiers had arrived, men recently returned from Europe. They stared at the German women with cold suspicion. One muttered, "My brother died fightin' their people. And now we feed him." The question hung in the air, heavy and real. Carter's jaw tightened. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly why." Ilsa overheard the exchange. For the first time, she felt the weight of being forgiven by those who had every reason not to. That burden was heavier than guilt. She returned to her bunk that night with shaking hands, the rib's sweetness still on her tongue. The narrator's voice would slow, solemn now. "Kindness unsettles more deeply than cruelty. It forces the enemy to see themselves not as victims or victors, but as human." Outside, the cicadas began their nightly chorus. The stars spread wide and merciless over the Texas sky. Ilsa lay awake, staring upward, her thoughts unraveling one by one. The Führer's speeches, the bombings, the hunger, the endless orders. All of it seemed smaller than the warmth of one man's fire. When she finally rose to close the window, she saw Carter dousing the last of the flames. The smoke rose straight and pale into the night before disappearing into the dark. Something inside her whispered, not in words but in feeling. This was what freedom might look like, not power but peace. And as she turned away, a new sound drifted faintly through the camp. An approaching truck engine. The kind that meant orders. Transfers. Change. Whatever peace they had built was about to be tested. The trucks arrived at dawn, engines rumbling through mist that smelled faintly of smoke and magnolia. A cold wind swept across the yard, stirring ash from the old barbecue pit. Ilsa stood at the doorway of her barack, buttoning her worn jacket, eyes tracing the silhouettes of soldiers unloading crates near the gate. Something was different this time. The mood taut, the easy laughter gone. Greta appeared beside her, hair hastily braided. "Orders," she whispered. "They're moving us." Ilsa didn't answer. She had known it was coming. The war was collapsing faster than news could cross the ocean. Yet her chest tightened all the same. Major Harlan's voice cut through the morning. "All prisoners from Section C will prepare for transport within the hour." His tone was brisk, procedural, but softer than it once had been. He paused, glancing toward Carter, who stood by the pit wiping his hands on a towel. Their eyes met briefly, an understanding too quiet for words. Carter nodded once. "I'll get breakfast goin'," he said. "Ain't nobody leaving here hungry." The women packed what little they owned, letters, scarves, hand-sewn trinkets from months of captivity. Anna clutched a small cornbread tin she had been given after the last barbecue, now empty but polished like gold. "I will keep it," she said in broken English. "It remind me of good smell." Greta smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "Americans," she murmured. "They feed us as if food is peace." By the time the sun burned through the mist, Carter had the fire going again. He moved slower than usual, as if memorizing each motion. The swing of the tongs, the hiss of grease hitting coals. Ilsa approached him quietly, holding 2 tin cups. "Coffee," she said, offering one. He took it, surprised. "You didn't have to." She hesitated. "Neither did you," she replied, then added softly. "All those Sundays." The words hung between them like smoke. Simple, heavy, final. Daniels appeared, rolling up his sleeves. "Major says we got time for one last meal," he said. "Guess you get a farewell feast." Carter snorted. "Wouldn't call it a feast, more like goodbye breakfast." He handed Ilsa a piece of bread. She broke it in half and gave the larger portion back. For a moment, their fingers touched. It was the smallest act of rebellion against everything they had been taught to believe about each other. The fire snapped. The ribs, leaner this time, rationed to the last, sizzled in silence. The smell drifted across the camp, mingling with the scent of dust and diesel. The women lined up automatically, but the tension was different now. They weren't prisoners awaiting orders. They were travelers uncertain of their next destination. As Carter served the plates, one of the guards began to hum a tune. Low, mournful, the same, "You Are My Sunshine," that had once played from the Jeep radio. Ilsa recognized it instantly. Her throat ached. When she took her plate, she looked up at Carter. "Will we go home?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. "Eventually," he said. "But not today. War's still untangling itself." She nodded, swallowing hard. "In Germany, we have nothing left. Maybe not even homes." Carter met her gaze. "Then start fresh. That's what we do here." The simplicity of it, start fresh, felt impossible and yet intoxicating. The meal began without speeches. Just the quiet sounds of eating, the occasional laugh, the hiss of the fire. Greta leaned close to Ilsa. "Remember when we called this Bauernfutter? Farmhand food." Ilsa smiled sadly. "Yes. I was proud of my hunger then." Greta wiped her fingers on a napkin. "And now?" Ilsa looked at the rib in her hand, its edges glistening. "Now I think it tastes like forgiveness." Major Harlan stood near the gate, smoking, watching them. When the last bites were taken, he called for loading. The women rose reluctantly. A few tried to thank the guards in halting English. Daniels tipped his hat, awkwardly muttering, "Good luck to y'all." One woman curtsied, embarrassed by her own instinct. Carter approached Ilsa with a small brown paper parcel. "For the road," he said. She frowned. "You already gave us breakfast." He shook his head. "This one's for later. When you think it's all gone." She took it, the weight light but the gesture heavy. "Danke," she whispered. He smiled. "You're welcome, ma'am. Safe travels." As they boarded the trucks, a wind picked up, scattering ash from the pit. It whirled around them like gray snow. Ilsa clutched the paper parcel tight against her chest, the warmth seeping through. She glanced back. Carter stood by the fading fire, one hand raised in farewell. For a second, she thought he looked like a monument carved from sunlight and smoke. The trucks jolted forward, gears grinding. Through the slats, Ilsa watched the camp recede. The mess tents, the pecan trees, the barbed wire gleaming in the sun. It struck her that even beauty could exist within fences. Greta leaned against her shoulder, whispering, "Maybe America wins because it does not hate." Ilsa didn't reply. Her eyes stayed fixed on the figure shrinking in the distance, the one man whose kindness had undone everything propaganda had built. Hours later, the convoy stopped at a railway station on the edge of town. Civilians gathered to watch. The sight of German uniforms still carried weight. Yet there was no jeering, only quiet curiosity. An old woman handed apples through the fence to one of the prisoners. Ilsa saw it happen and felt something crack deep within her. This country gives even when it doesn't have to. On the train, as the wheels clattered eastward, she opened the parcel. Inside were 2 ribs wrapped in wax paper, and a folded note written in uneven pencil. "When you taste this again, remember, it ain't about the food." She stared at it for a long time, fingers trembling. Greta peered over. "What does it say?" Ilsa shook her head, eyes burning. "It says, 'Freedom smells like smoke.'" Outside the window, fields rolled by in endless gold. She leaned her head against the glass, watching the horizon stretch wider than any she had ever seen in Europe. The train's rhythm lulled the camp sounds back into memory. The laughter, the harmonica, the soft pop of fire. For a moment, she felt as though Texas itself were still breathing around her, whispering that life could begin again. The narrator's voice would return, steady, reflective. In the months that followed, most of the German women at Camp Tyler were repatriated to a shattered homeland. Yet many carried with them a strange affection for their captors. Letters later surfaced. Thank you notes written in careful English, describing kindness they could not explain. Ilsa's letter, found decades later in an archive, read simply, "We thought we had been conquered by power. But it was goodness that defeated us." As the train curved toward the eastern horizon, the last of the barbecue smoke faded from her hair. She touched the note once more, folded it, and tucked it inside her coat. For the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to hope that the world could taste sweet again. The narrator's closing words would hover like embers in still air. History remembers wars through fire and ruin. But sometimes, the truest victory is served quietly, between strangers who choose to feed rather than to hate. And as the scene faded, the train receding, the Texas fields dissolving into light, the sound of a crackling fire returned one last time. A reminder that even in captivity, a single act of warmth could burn brighter than the war that built the fences.